Hello everyone, welcome back. We are taking a look at providence and how God's providence works in our everyday lives. This is our second conversation about that. In our first discussion, we talked about different kinds of providence, sort of a general and particular. The general is the notion that God provides the universe and keeps things going, like the seasons changing and we have food and all of that. Particular providence relates to God being at work in the small things of our lives. And we mentioned last time a Bible verse that's very important for a lot of people. And for some people, this is probably their favorite or one of their favorite verses in Scripture. And it's Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And of all the verses that are out there, this is the one that is used most often to speak of God's providence. And in ancient manuscripts, there are two principal variants of this verse, and they're reflected in two English translations. One is King James, "All things work together for good to them that love God." The other variant is represented by the Revised Standard, which reads, "In everything, God works for good with those who love Him." There's a big difference between these two. The King James is the most influential English translation that has ever been in history. And so it has influenced much of our theology and our thinking. But here, the King James, in my view, is not the more accurate. Grammatically speaking, in this verse in King James, God is not the subject of the sentence. The subject is all things. So listen to the sentence. All things work together for good to them that love God. So King James is saying all things, that's the subject, work together for good. In the Revised Standard Version, God is the subject. And so we get a very different meaning. In everything, God works for good with those who love Him. And so if you look at the King James, everything works together for good for those who love God, and you push that a little bit, you wind up saying that if you love God, then everything's great. If you love God, then all things work together for good. If you love God, your life is going to be just fine. Well, the Revised Standard has a very different way of looking at it. Here, in the Revised Standard, where God is the subject, you can understand that not everything is going to work out. Not everything is going to be just fine. But even in the bad times, even in disaster, even in crises and disappointment, God is working with us to bring about good. And in my view, the King James is just way too optimistic. It even negates the reality of evil. And in truth, not everything does work for good for Christian people. We do not live charmed lives. Christian parents have suffered the loss of children. That is not good. Christians have been killed in war. That is not good. Christians have suffered because of flood, tornado, earthquake, fire, COVID-19. That is not good. And popular ideas about God's will or God's providence that have been influenced by the King James translation of Romans 8:28 include a lot of pithy little sayings that you hear people remark, or you yourself may have said some of these things at times. Whatever will be, will be. Everything works out for the best. Everything happens for a reason. And did you ever notice that people say these things when life is difficult? People rarely, if ever, say these things when everything is going well. How many times have you been to a funeral or a funeral visitation and you heard somebody say, well, everything works out for the best? You probably heard that at a funeral. How many times have you been to a wedding, and at a wedding reception, somebody would say, well, everything works out for the best? Or how many times have you visited a young couple and they've just had a baby and everybody's healthy and everything's good, and somebody says, well, everything works out for the best? We don't say that when things are good. We only say that when life is difficult. Whatever will be, will be. It is a statement of resignation. It is giving up. It is abdicating our responsibility in life. And to say everything works out for the best, that denies human responsibility. Sometimes nothing at all works out for the best unless we get involved in the work. God works with us in all things. Some people also say that tragedy can really be a blessing in disguise. Like, well, the Lord knows best. I know that your husband died and he was only 32 years old, but God knows best. Well, that's often said at such times, premature death or some sort of tragedy. Now, my grandfather believed that when it was your time to go, it was your time to go. He was a big fan of that. He would even sit out on his porch in a metal rocking chair during a thunderstorm. And on one occasion, when my parents started dating and my dad came up to visit his girlfriend's parents, my then yet-to-be grandfather was doing just that, sitting in a metal chair on a screened-in porch in the middle of a thunderstorm. And my father walked out there, my yet-to-be father, and he said, Mr. Rankin, I'm not sure this is a good idea to be around all this metal in the thunderstorm. And my grandfather said, well, when it's your time to go, it's your time to go. And my dad responded, well, that may be, but I don't want to tempt the Lord on that one. So in situations of serious illness or death, if we say God knows best or everything works out for the best, then what do we need the medical community for? Why do we even go to a doctor? Are doctors working against the will of God? Are hospitals some sort of fiendish institution that conspire against the divine will? So if you really believe when it's your time to go, it's your time to go, and a friend of yours is having a heart attack, do you call 911? Or do you just look at your friend gasping for air with the life seeping out of them and say, well, there, buddy, I know you're just 45 years old, but God knows best. I hope you don't. I hope you call 911. If you know CPR, I hope you do CPR on that person. In everything, God works for good with those who love him. It does not mean life is going to be perfect, but it does mean in the good times and in the bad times, God is with us. And that's the way that I understand God's providence. God did not create COVID-19. God did not make a pandemic upon our world. God knows it's there, and God works with us in this time of difficulty so that things might be able to work out in a good way. So I believe with all my heart that God does work in death and in illness. I do not believe God causes death. I do not believe God kills people. God doesn't take away your husband. God doesn't take away your child because he needs another angel. That is ridiculous. But God works in tragedy to bring good out of it. And God always seeks to work with us to bring about good from bad situations. The ultimate example of that is the cross itself. Good Friday was not a good day. We call it Good Friday because Easter follows. Good Friday is a holy day only because of the resurrection. So the cross, the death of the Son of God, was not a good thing. But the power of God worked in that tragedy to bring about good, not just for God's own Son, but to bring about good for all of us, the gift of salvation. God always wants to work with us for good when things are bad and when everything is great. And so what we are doing day in and day out, when we work with God or when we make pronouncements that are glib and inaccurate, to say, well, God knows best, what we're doing is something called triage theology. Triage theology is theology done on the run. It's done without time for hours of reflection and prayer and study. It's like the difference between going to medical school and learning everything you need to know to be a physician, or skipping medical school and going straight to the ER and administering help to patients. So we need to do what we can to learn from our tradition and not be so glib about theological statements that we make on the run. There is a healthy way to do triage theology, and we're going to talk about that in our next discussion about God's providence in Providence series number 3 of how to do triage theology and how to stay connected to our tradition and to have integrity in what we say and in what we do as faithful Christians who work with God to bring about good for our world. Thank you so much for joining me.